Chapter 5. The First Name. The corridor ended, and the store was back. Ethan took one step and realized he was standing in aisle 29, one hand already out to catch himself against the shelving, his knees on the verge of giving. The chickpea pallet was exactly where it had been. The box cutter was still in his back pocket. The overhead fluorescent he had been working under was still broken. Still steady now, just a dead light above an ordinary aisle in an ordinary store. Except nothing was ordinary. Pattern sight was still running behind his eyes. He could feel it now as a second kind of breathing, a faculty that had turned itself on in the corridor and would not turn off. The store had seams. The tile lines had weight. The chrome strips on the shelving pulsed faintly with the same silver light the corridor floor had carried. The edge of every object had become legible to him as a choice somebody had made, and the world had stopped pretending it was made of one thing instead of 1,000 layered ones. Still here, he whispered. Still real. He wasn't sure which answer he wanted. The arguing couple was still at the register. The cashier was still scanning.
The squeaky trolley wheel was still squeaking somewhere in produce. Life continued in the store in its thoughtless Tuesday evening rhythm, and Ethan stood in the middle of it for several seconds before he registered the thing that was different. One of the fluorescents, 2 aisles over, was flickering. In a rhythm. Not his rhythm. The one that had caught him had been 3-2-1. This one was 2-1, 2-1. A different sequence, running above a different aisle, for a different person. Ethan's stomach lurched. He wasn't the only one. He moved before the thought completed. Down aisle 29. Around the end cap, past the hand sanitizer display where someone had knocked over a bottle earlier and hadn't bothered to pick it up, into the aisle with the flickering light. There was a girl standing in the middle of the aisle. She was maybe 17. Navy school blazer, a basket at her feet with 4 or 5 things in it.
A can of soup was rolling slowly across the tile toward Ethan's foot. And in the small part of his brain that was still tracking irrelevant details, he realized that the can was rolling at the wrong speed for gravity. It had that faint, dreamy slowness that dust had had in the stone corridor, the slightly wrong physics that belonged to whatever was happening to her. Her eyes were open. Her eyes were wide open and fixed and unblinking. Above her head, shimmering into visibility through his pattern sight, a grid had unfolded. 3 by 3. A puzzle. The same clean geometry he had solved in front of the chickpea pallet an hour and a half ago, except this one was live and running and metered, and the symbols in it were not his symbols. Circles, squares, triangles. The 3 shapes of the Codex, arranged in a pattern he could read in one glance. "Oh," he said. "Oh, no, no, no." He crossed the last 3 meters in a stride. "Hey," his voice came out too loud in the aisle's hollow acoustic. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her pupils shifted. Barely. The way a needle twitches on a dial when a voltage changes somewhere far away. She could hear him. She was alone inside a puzzle she couldn't read. Ethan looked up at the grid. His brain cataloged it in the time it took him to take a breath. Top row, circle, square, triangle. Middle row, square, triangle, circle. Bottom row, triangle, circle, blank. The pattern was a simple rotation. Each row was the previous row shifted 1 position left. Following that logic, the bottom right cell should be the symbol that completed the shift, which was square. A square would close the pattern cleanly. Each row 1 rotation of the previous, all 3 symbols appearing once in each row and once in each column. It was the same kind of puzzle he had already solved. He was already opening his mouth to tell her. Bottom right, he said. It's a square. Bottom right cell. Trust me, the answer is a square. Her hand began to move. Slow, underwater slow, the same wrong speed as the rolling can. Her finger lifted from where it had been hanging at her side. It drifted upward toward the grid. It was going to touch the empty cell, and when it did, the cell would fill with whatever answer she committed to, and the trial would resolve. Ethan took a step back and let her work. He felt, briefly, proud. He had helped. He had been given a faculty, and he was using it, and a stranger's life was about to be saved because he had been paying attention for 30 years to the exact kind of thing that nobody else paid attention to. Her finger touched the cell. A square bloomed where her finger was. The grid went red. Trial failed. Ethan didn't move.
He was aware, on a low background channel, that he had just said no out loud. He was aware that his hand had flown up and hit an invisible barrier between him and the girl, solid as glass, and was still pressed against it. He was aware that the boundary was cold, and that the coldness was traveling up his arm, and that somewhere behind him, the flicker above her aisle had stopped. The girl's eyes rolled back in her head. She collapsed. She hit the tile like a sack of something that had stopped being a person halfway through the fall, a flat, final sound that Ethan would keep hearing in his head in smaller rooms for the rest of his life. The can of soup, still rolling, bumped gently against her outflung arm and stopped. The flicker in the fluorescent above her aisle cut out. The boundary in front of Ethan dissolved. He took one step forward and sank to his knees on the tile beside her. Somewhere 2 aisles over, a woman started screaming. Ethan didn't hear her clearly. He was looking at the grid, which had not disappeared, which was fading, but not gone.
And in the top right corner of the grid, as small as a price tag on an imported cheese, there was a line of text he had not seen before. The text read, Rule INVERT. He stared at it. He stared at it for long enough that the grid had time to fade the rest of the way and disappear, and he was left staring at empty air, the words still floating in his head the way afterimages float when you look away from a bright light. INVERT. Her puzzle had the opposite rule. The answer was not the symbol that completed the pattern. The answer was the symbol that didn't, the one that broke it, the one that interrupted the rotation and refused to close the cycle. Given her grid, circle, square, triangle in the first row, rotating downward, the breaking symbol was the one that was already overrepresented, or the one that was already absent, depending on the inversion logic. He ran it in his head while kneeling over her body. Triangle. The answer was triangle. He had told her square.
He had told her square, with complete confidence, in the tone of a man who was sure he knew. And his confidence had gotten into her underwater body and her underwater hand, and she had trusted him, and she had placed a square. And then the grid had gone red. And then she had died. The world came back at that point. The girl's slowness cleared. The can of soup rolled a final few centimeters on ordinary physics and came to rest against her. A shopper turning into the aisle, a woman in her 50s with a basket over her arm, saw the girl on the floor, inhaled sharply, and said, "Oh, God," in the particular voice of a stranger who has just encountered a stranger's emergency. "Are you okay?" she was saying, already pulling out her phone. "Honey, can you hear me?" Ethan was aware of her only from a long way away. The shopper would call an ambulance. The girl's body would be taken somewhere. She had a name that would be on a phone somewhere in her blazer pocket, And that phone would be answered, and somebody's mother would have a Tuesday night that would end differently from how it had begun. And none of those people, none of them, not the stranger calling the ambulance, not the dispatcher, not the paramedics, not the girl's mother, would ever know what had actually killed her. A 30-year-old stockroom employee in aisle 29 who had thought he was clever. Ethan put his palms against his eyes and pressed until he saw light behind them. I killed her. Not metaphorically, not by failing to save her, by speaking. He had looked at the grid and been certain, and his certainty had come out of his mouth in a voice she trusted. And his certainty had been wrong. Because every trial in this place was personalized, and every rule could be rewritten. And the rule hidden in the corner of her grid had been the one that mattered. And he hadn't looked for it, because he had already known.
He lowered his hands. The small, hard thing inside him that had been congratulating itself on pattern sight had gone very, very quiet. "I won't do that again," he said. His voice was small, flat, nothing dramatic. The words came out the way any promise comes out when the person making it has just understood what it will cost to keep. Then, across the store, the first light in aisle 14 started flickering. Then the lights in aisle 7. Then every light in the store at once. Ethan got to his feet. A man near the checkout went rigid mid-step, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. A woman by the entrance dropped her phone and did not pick it up. A child in the candy aisle was crying, and then wasn't. Her small face going slack with the same underwater stillness the teenage girls had gone slack with. It was happening everywhere. A new message bloomed in front of him, larger than the ones that had come before, the text sharp and clean in the air. Global initialization, phase 1. Participants detected 7,842,113. Ethan read the number twice. 7,842,113 people. A clank, and a second clank, and then a hard mechanical cascade as the security gates at the front of the store began to drop. Steel, heavy, one after another, sealing the exits. A woman at the front of the store screamed for her husband, who was on the other side. A man tried to duck under a gate and pulled back with his jacket torn halfway up his ribs. The store wasn't a store anymore. The air had become structured. Pattern sight could see it, layer by layer, the walls rearranging themselves behind the seams, the whole building folding into something it had never been, the fluorescents dropping their pitch into a deep, resonant hum that set Ethan's molars aching. A second message in front of him, personal. Zone trial initiated. Location, commercial sector, node 17. Participants, 42. Objective, reach the core. Failure condition, death. Cooperation, optional. Deception, permitted. He read the last line twice. Deception permitted. Of course, he said. He looked down at his hands. They were still shaking from the girl. One rule, he said, to nobody, to the store, to the thing that had erased the doorway behind him in the last corridor. One rule from here. Don't be certain. He straightened. He pushed himself away from the shelving. He stepped forward into air that had stopped being air, and the store dissolved around him.